It's quite fascinating, really, when you read a book like Daniel. You kind of think to yourself that God keeps on doing remarkable things. I mean, if I asked you, what do you remember about the book of Daniel? The vast majority of you would come up at least with the fiery furnace, Daniel in the lion's den. You might know about the dream that he had in chapter 2. You hopefully know that he had a dream in chapter 4 as well, if you were here on Sunday. If you weren't, that's okay. And you would probably be forgiven for thinking that the God of Daniel really ought to be with us today, so that he does these remarkable things, it seems, every other chapter. It's easy to forget that Daniel came in chapter 1 aged between 14 and 17. And by the time we get to chapter 5, as we do, he's 87 or 88. So those incidents that you get are well spread out. In fact, the dream that we talked about on Sunday and this one tonight were 30 to 40 years spaced. My guess is that if you're my kind of age, you can remember at least one really remarkable thing that God did in your life that you thought, wow, can't believe he did that. Well, you're just like Daniel, you see, because Daniel's God is exactly the same God. What he does for us in his book is to put together the remarkable acts of God in order to establish one main principle that's written big across Daniel from beginning to end, that the Most High rules in men's affairs, in the kingdoms of men. He sets up who he will, and he puts down those he desires to. He's that kind of God. And as I mentioned on Sunday, with the elections looming day after tomorrow, it seems a bit of a joke, really, doesn't it? We sometimes forget in all the mess that seems to be going on around us that God is still the God, as we often used to sing, who is still on the throne. He is. And tonight we're going to have a look at what happens when a king decides that he will stand face to face and toe to toe with the God of heaven. And he says, I'm going to show God who really is the true God. I've called it Written by God. It's Daniel chapter 5, as we have already mentioned. Something very striking happens between chapter 4 of Daniel and chapter 5. Now, you might remember at the end of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar says, God, the God of heaven, he truly is the Most High God, and everyone ought to exalt and glorify and worship this God. He's a supernatural God. He's a universal God. He is an eternal God. But you enter chapter 5 and it looks very different. One of the very first things that happens as you come right to the very beginning of it is you start off with King Belshazzar. And you think, what in the world has happened to Nebuchadnezzar? Where did he just suddenly disappear to? Well, the answer is he died. There was this major generational change, which is fascinating within itself. Because remember, one of the things that Daniel said about God was that his kingdom endures from generation to generation. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn, like all of us here in this room, some of us closer than others, that life will not go on forever. It just won't. When my dear mother-in-law died 2 years ago, I hate to tell you this, but one of the problems of that is you're the next generation to go. That's how it happens, isn't it? And we realize that actually we are not invincible, we are not eternal. And a generational change took place, actually extremely quickly. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. There'll be a test on this afterwards. And his son, Evil Merodach, don't worry, the evil bit doesn't mean he was evil, it's just his name. It was big in Babylonian. I mean, that in Chaldean language. I mean, that was an okay word. And he came to the throne, as you can see, in 562. And he only lasted for 2 years. Remember, we're in BC, so everything goes backwards. It's kind of hard to work it out sometimes, isn't it? He's actually mentioned in 2 Kings 25:27. And I mention this because it really is quite a little cameo that's quite exciting, I think, anyway. Because what happened then is he was the emperor in Babylon who released Jehoiakim, C-H-I-N on the end, from prison and allowed him to go back to the land again. He released him from prison. The wonder of that, you remember good King Josiah? Let me backtrack quickly. He had 3 sons. The middle son was called Eliakim, but his name was changed to Jehoiakim. He had a son called Jehoiakim, who was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. But Ephraim-Merodach released him. The wonder of that is that Jehoiakim and his son Jehoiakim are in the line that eventually led to Jesus. Isn't that good? He lived long enough to produce a son in order that we might see Jesus coming into our world and declaring, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Great message that, isn't it? He seems to be insignificant. What's the point of even mentioning it? Well, the answer is that here was a Babylonian emperor who allowed, in the natural way, Jesus to be born into our world. Well, he, as I said, didn't last very long, and he was supplanted by, taken over by, when he died, by a man called Neriglissar, or his other name is equally as bad. And he became king from 560 to 556, so he didn't last very long either, just 4 years. He's also mentioned in Jeremiah. He, at that particular time, was just one of the high-ranking officials. But he married into royalty, Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And because of that, and because there were no sons from Ephraim-Merodach, he became king, or emperor, is the truth of it. His son, who has that wonderful name, the Marduk on the end actually is the name of the chief god of the Babylonians, and he didn't last even a year. You begin to see the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, sets up over it who they will. They seem to think that they were mighty and powerful, but God supplanted them one after the other. In fact, he never had any children either, being a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. This is what happened. Nabonidus, his other grandson on his wife's side, became the emperor. And his son was, you're glad we got there at last, Belshazzar. So you can even see that actually the family links were very tenuous, because it's the Most High who rules in the kingdoms of men. And here is this man called Belshazzar. I don't even remember it, but Daniel's Aramaic Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. Belshazzar and Belteshazzar basically meant roughly the same thing, but certainly that they paid allegiance to the god Bel. That was the reason why Daniel got that particular name. And this battle that goes on between the gods of Babylon and the God of heaven is what this chapter's all about. I want to say we live in a world, don't we, of many competing gods, really, that compete for our time, that compete for our energy. We live in a world where God himself, our God, is sidelined. Frequently there are those who stand up and say, where is this God then that you talk about? And we're living in that time where there is major opposition both to Christianity and to God himself. Well, how do we deal with circumstances like that? This chapter will both encourage us and help us, I think, to answer that particular question. Let me give you a quick pen portrait, well, Daniel does it for us, of what this king was like. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 nobles and drank wine with them. That's a pretty big banquet, isn't it? 1,000 nobles? Well, when you begin to see that it wasn't just 1,000 nobles who were there, this is what happened. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, the word that's used there for father is basically ancestor. It could have been father, grandfather, great-grandfather. It's used of all of those, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that the king and his nobles, his wife and his concubines, his mistresses, might drink from them. So now you've got this feast. It's more than a feast. It's closer on an orgy, I would say, with all this wine flowing freely, with lots of wives and lots of mistresses all being in the same room, as if it didn't matter how you lived your life. And into the middle of that mix, he brought the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had brought back from the temple in Jerusalem. At least Nebuchadnezzar had had the sense to put them in the house of his God. There was some sort of reverence paid to the God of heaven, though to Nebuchadnezzar in the early days, it would just have been that the God of Israel was one of the other many gods around. But this king says, I am going to show you that my God is greater than your God. So he defames the name of God by bringing the goblets and the other things that were made of silver and gold and bringing them into his drunken orgy. That's what Nebuchadnezzar did with them, as I just mentioned. He carried off them to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put them in the treasure house of his God. The reason we know that this was spiritually induced was because verse 4 says, as they drank wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. All of the gods and the images that they had, no doubt, round the room or round the walls of the palace in which this feast was held. They worshipped their gods as if to say, who is this God of heaven who my grandfather spoke about? It was a direct challenge to God. You got up to that kind of challenge? Do we have a God who truly is a God worth following? One of the great things about God, to my heart, is he's patient. Isn't that amazing? I have worked out that I want God to be patient with me and not patient with my enemies, but he's patient because he is a long-suffering God. It takes a lot to get God really angry, but here was one of those things that actually got him very angry, and this is what God did. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote on the plaster on the wall. You remember chapter 4? Chapter 4, written by Nebuchadnezzar. A pagan king writes a whole chapter of the Bible. Chapter 5, God himself uses his own finger to write on the plaster on the wall. There are at least two reasons that I can find why God actually at that time wrote with his finger. The first time that I can find in the Bible that God wrote with his finger, well, I assume it was with his finger anyway. He wrote the 10 Commandments with the finger of God in stone. First commandment, you shall have no other God before me. Fascinating that, isn't it? That's the very first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. I don't know if you've ever puzzled why that's the first commandment. If it'd been me, I probably would have put don't murder as my first commandment, wouldn't you? That seems to me to be one of the really big commandments. God says, here's the commandment number 1, don't have any other gods before me, because everything flows from that. It's a mindset. We have a God who is worth worshipping, who we need to follow. Have no other gods before me. And the second thing he says is, don't make any images to those gods. And they were worshipping gods made of all kinds of stuff, right the way through from gold and silver to stone. And God says you don't make any image of any of the gods. And his third one was, you do not take the name of your Lord your God in vain. And he had broken all 3 commandments in one fell swoop. So God writes this time in a language that this king is going to get. Well, not instantly, but a language that the king's going to get. And what I've come to value so highly about God is that if I don't listen to him, he somehow or other has a means to make me sit up and listen. He writes in a language that perhaps startles me or puzzles me or bothers me, but a language I get. I tell you, if I'd been God, I'd have given up on me a long time ago. But praise his name. He's the kind of God who never gives up on us. And he didn't even give up on this king. I don't know whether he made that connection, the king, but I'm pretty confident Daniel did. There's another time where we see God writing with his finger. Only this time we don't know what he wrote. You find the story in John chapter 8. And it's the woman caught in adultery who was brought before Jesus. And Jesus is going to say to them, the one who's without sin can cast the first stone. But before he does that, this is what it says. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Now, I don't know what he wrote. I don't know whether he wrote, you shall love the Lord your God. I have no idea what he wrote, but I know he wrote on the ground. And he did it in this context. See, if you have a look at that now, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand. John chapter 8 is the passage that comes immediately before those immortal words of Jesus, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness. And here's Jesus writing on the ground as if to say, this is the same kind of genre that Daniel knew about. Writing with my finger on the ground to tell you that here's a message that you need to listen and you need to turn from the darkness, in this particular case, when Jesus wrote on the ground, of your religious dogma and turn to me, the one who illuminates your page and who illuminates your life. Fascinating, isn't it? Jesus wrote on the plaster of the wall. I don't know if you noticed this, but we actually use that expression today, don't we? The writing's on the wall. Isn't it amazing how God has put part of the Bible right into our normal speak? Now I want to tell you, I'm no film buff, and I'm rubbish at modern music, but I found that in the song that was used for the film Spectre, Sam Smith sings, for you I have to risk it all, because the writing's on the wall. I bet he didn't know that he was writing directly from Daniel chapter 5. And God has somehow put that right in the front of us to understand. The idea of writing on the wall, says the Cambridge English Dictionary, something will fail or will no longer exist. And God put the writing on the wall, and we've remembered it ever since. The problem is what was the writing? I mean, what did it mean? Who could possibly even begin to understand it? So much so that once again, remember on Sunday I mentioned to you that the scary, awfully frightening, terrifying dream was a dream of a tree, which scares nobody. Well, this is a disembodied hand writing on the wall. That is a bit more scary. I will accept that. I've never ever seen that happening. But he didn't understand the words, so why in the world was he scared? I think this is quite fascinating. Belshazzar was in the middle of a feast when all this happened. They were all eating and they were drinking and they were having a great time. That's chapter 5. Chapter 1, Daniel and his 3 friends refuse the feast of Nebuchadnezzar. And they refuse his wine completely. At the end of those 10 days, their faces look brighter and better than they had done before they refused to eat. Now see what happens here. Here's a king who, with no thought for God, is feasting on the finest that his empire could possibly produce. It is likely, particularly on account of one of the things we read in chapter 4, it is likely that the emperor feasted while many of his people suffered hunger. Remember, part of what God said to Nebuchadnezzar was you need to change your ways and remember those who are oppressed and poor. Well, it now looks as if the thing has completely turned round. And instead of his face looking brighter and better after all that feasting, he is so scared that his face turns pale. His legs become so weak that they visibly knock together. I have not seen that many times in my life, when somebody's knees actually properly knocked together. But that's what happened in this particular case. It was writing that induced terror. But it was also very meaningful writing. Then he said to the wise men of Babylon, now remember what happened when he had the dream. Nebuchadnezzar has the dream. He immediately calls in all these wise people. He said, I need to have it interpreted. This isn't a dream, this is reality. There are 4 words on the wall. That's it. 4. And he looks at the words on the wall and he says, what in the world do those mean? There are at least 2 things he might have meant by that. One of the things about Eastern language is that there are no vowels, only consonants. So we know the 4 words, mene, mene, tekel, parsin. So in mene there's only 2, M and an N. So where do you put the vowels? At the beginning, at the end, in the middle, or how many vowels go in the middle? So that was the dilemma initially. What did the words actually mean? What did they say? There would have been a variety of possible explanations for it. I mean, if you were writing, for example, without any vowels, and you wrote THNK, it could be thank, couldn't it? Oh, but it might be think. And they're not similar, are they? So there was a bit of a dilemma into actually the meaning of the words. But worse still for the king was he didn't know not just what the words said, but why were they written on the wall? What in the world did all of this mean? And as we're going to see as we go through, there was something that it appears the court picked up about these words. But they still didn't quite understand the conundrum that the words really were. Well, he says to the wise men, read this, and I will make you 3rd ruler in the kingdom. And you think, 3rd? How about 2nd? Well, the reason he couldn't offer 2nd was that his father was actually still alive, and he lived mainly in Arabia. And his son was co-regent with him, number 1, number 2. So the best he could offer was 3rd in the kingdom. Would you have accepted it? Sounds quite a tempting offer, doesn't it? 3rd in this illustrious kingdom. Let's see what Daniel does when eventually he comes there. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they couldn't read the writing. No idea what it says. And they couldn't tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew even more pale. I don't know how you become pale, but this king became not just white, but pale, pale white. Terrified. His nobles stood there completely baffled. What in the world do we do about this? Because God does really simple things in order that his name might be known and glorified. He doesn't have to bring earthquakes. He doesn't have to suddenly surround the place with armies. He doesn't have to thunder from heaven. He writes. That's all he does. Admittedly on the wall, but he writes by the lamp in order that they might know that he truly is the God of heaven. Well, the queen, probably the queen mother actually. It's one of those generic terms. More likely to have been the queen mother. Hearing the voices of the king and the nobles came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever. Don't at all be frightened or be terrified. Don't look so pale. I don't know how you stop looking pale when you're so terrified. But there we are. That's what she said. Mothers have a way of saying these things, don't they? You don't have to agree. It's okay. Mother's there. They seem to have a way of saying, don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods. Indeed, this man was a spiritual man. And the man she was talking about was Daniel. Call Daniel. He will tell you what the writing means. Now, the reason it's most likely that actually she was the queen mother is that she was old enough to remember Daniel from before. 30 years before, she remembered this Daniel who told the king exactly what his dream was. There's a fascinating play of words here. In this chapter, Daniel is never called Belteshazzar. He's always called Daniel. Do you know what Daniel means? God is my judge. It's as if his name proclaimed. God will judge you for this, Belshazzar. You need to listen to what he's saying. You, Belshazzar, with your good spiritual name of your deity, have come face to face with the God of heaven, and I am his servant, Daniel, the L on the end, telling you that this is all about God. And this God is the God who will judge you, the God who will assess you. It's not so much punishment, rather assessment. He'll show you exactly who you really are. I want to pause just for a moment. Imagine being Daniel living in Babylon. God took you there when you were 17. You've never ever seen home since that day. Families disappeared. You don't know any of your nieces and nephews. I don't think Daniel was ever married from what we can gather. You've never seen any of your family ever again. And God's left you there. And every now and again, God seems to do something with you. But can you imagine now that here he is, the man of God in waiting, just for that one moment when God said, I've got something for you to do, Daniel. I want you to go and I want you to meet with the king. I want to encourage you. And God's got something for you to do. And wherever you are at this moment, he has put you there for his particular purpose. He's got something brilliant and wonderful for you to do. Yesterday evening, I think I mentioned this on Sunday, we had a Bible study in our house. We had 9 young people, mainly guys, but some girls as well. And we've been going through the book of Ezra. And it's been really exciting listening to them talk. Before we got down to it, I said, anything we need to pray and praise for this week. And one of the guys there, Reese, he said, not this Reese, another Reese. He said, my job now, they've moved me into an office, and I'm an office on my own, and I never see anybody. It kills him. He's very sociable, and he loves telling people about Jesus. And he said, I've got nobody to tell, because they just don't come near me anymore. But he said, on Wednesday of last week, he said, I was sent up to Manchester, and I went on the train. So he said, just before I got on the train, I said, God, give me somebody to talk to. Give me somebody to talk to. I want to talk to somebody about Jesus. And when he sat down, a guy came and sat next to him. And, Reese, being Reese, he's that sort of person, seems to somehow manage to get a conversation round to talking about the Lord. And he talked about the Lord to this guy, and he said it went really well, but he said, you know what happened? You won't believe this, but this is what happened. He said, the guy said to me, so what job do you do then? So I explained to him, and he does a lot of graphic stuff, and he was doing some work on his computer and whatever. And the guy said to him, well, would you consider coming to work for me? I could do with somebody like you. And there and then, on the train, he got a job to work in your neck of the woods, well, close by anyway, at least it's the valleys, the Gwent Valleys, he's up in Ebbw Vale. And he starts Thursday. He's never had an interview apart from a little bit on the telephone. Because he said, God, I really want to go and to be your person in this circumstance. Now, I know very well, knowing Reese, that the people who work in this guy was the CEO of this particular job. It's to do with waterproofing in roofs and stuff, so it's really high tech. And I'm not really sure what Reese is actually doing. I don't think he knows either. But he's got this job there, and I know very well that those people are going to hear about Jesus because God's got a job for us to do. Now I know some of you are thinking, but I retired recently. Let me tell you, Daniel's 87. Probably in this chapter. And I don't know if there's anybody here 87. It doesn't look like it to me. I might be wrong, of course, but it doesn't quite look like it. Some of us might be getting towards working towards 87. We've got a few decades to go yet, some of us. Daniel, you've got many more decades. But God called him at 87, which really excites me that he's still got something for us to do at that kind of age. Well, in comes Daniel. Daniel brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel?" So he evidently didn't know him. "One of the exiles my father brought from Judah." I mean, he's lived in Babylon for probably 70 years, nearly 70 years. And he's still an exile from Judah and proud of the God of heaven. He never forgot the fact that he had come there. Well, he wouldn't, would he? Because we know from Daniel 6, which we might do sometime, the lion's den bit. We know from Daniel 6 that every day he opened his window towards Jerusalem and prayed to the God of heaven. He never forgot the fact that he truly belonged to the Lord. Wherever he was and however long he'd been there, he really was a son of Judah. "Are you Daniel?" He says, "Yes, I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you. You have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom." Wow. That's some resume, isn't it? "The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing. Now tell me what it means and explain it. I've heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems." In the previous chapter, Daniel is a bit concerned about telling Nebuchadnezzar what the dream means. No such concerns flood him as he stands in front of Belshazzar. Maybe because he was 87, he thought, "I haven't got much long left anyway. Does it matter what he does to me?" He didn't know that he still had the lion's den to go into. You're beginning to get a picture now, aren't you? He's really old when he's with the lions. Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to somebody else." That was a pretty wise thing to do. I don't think Daniel knew exactly what was going to happen that day. But when we come to the end of the chapter, you will see that Belshazzar loses his life, his kingdom, and another king comes in. Who would want to be third in the kingdom when an invading power takes over? You might likely go the same way. Keep it for yourself, but I'll still tell you what it means, and this is what it means. The Most High God, he said, telling a story. Fascinating, really. Chapter 5 tells the story of chapter 4 again. The Most High God gave your father sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all nations and people of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble were humbled. That's because God gave him that position. But there happened to be a day when his heart was arrogant and hardened, as we talked about on Sunday, and he was deposed from his throne and driven away and stripped of his glory. And you'll remember the story, how he was like an animal and went out, and the dew of heaven fell on him until... I was going to say this on Sunday, but it just obviously wasn't to be, and I was supposed to say it tonight now instead. Don't you love that word until? There's always an until with God. God says this is what's going to happen. But there is a glorious until. There will be a time when this happens. Until he acknowledged that the Most High is sovereign in the kingdoms of earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. I love God's untils. Let me tell you, it's not always going to be like this. There's a great until. There's a great day coming when we're going to see him face to face. We're going to be like him. We're going to share his image. We're going to see his glory. We're going to be part of that kingdom. When we reign, when he reigns, we're going to reign with him. There's a great until that's going to happen. I don't know when, but it happened for Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar should have learnt that lesson. He knew the story because Daniel says, I know you know this, but let me tell you it all over again. And then he says this, but you, Belshazzar, have been brazenly irreverent. You have not humbled yourself. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. What a dangerous thing to do. He is the Lord of heavenly hosts. I know I spoke to you, I think it was back in January, about Joshua chapter 5 and about the wonder that he's the commander of heaven's armies. It's a dangerous thing to stand against the Lord. For us, that's a grand thing to know, isn't it? He doesn't always immediately come in his mighty power, but he's the God of angel armies. Instead, you set yourself against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and your nobles' wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You've set yourself against the Lord of heaven. Dangerous thing to do. For God is our judge. I think sometimes we as Christians forget that one day we're going to stand in front of God. And he wants to know, what have you done with what I gave you? It's a great sobering thought, isn't it? That one day we'll be in his presence. Glory, but he'll ask us. We'll have to give an account of ourselves to God. Well, Belshazzar scarcely believed that. And Daniel says, now let me tell you what this writing's all about. This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. I don't know how you pronounce it either, but that'll do. When they saw those words, and when he started to read them, they got it. Something that we wouldn't get because it's not in our language. The three words are related to each other, either as a series of value coins, penny, shilling, pound, or as weights, ounce, pound, stone, for example. I was going to use metric, and then I realized most of my congregation probably understand imperial better than they understand metric. What would you do if God wrote those three words, ounce, pound, stone? What in the world would you think about it? That's why even when they saw it, they didn't quite get it. What is God on about? Well, then Daniel says this is what the meaning was. Meaning, God has numbered your days and brought it to an end. The smallest bit, God has been counting your days. It's just a small bit, but they're coming to an end. See, it's not so bad if you know God's counted your days and they've got to come to an end. I mean, Jacob said that the days of his life were not very good, but he knew very well they were going to come to an end. Well, we all know that our lives are going to come to an end. But here's the damning thing from this. Tickle means you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. It's not just that God is counting your days, but you have come to meet, you are going to meet God at the end of these days knowing that you have failed and failed miserably. In fact, it's going to happen really quickly. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. No wonder he was white-faced when he heard that particular message. Our chapter ends like this. That very night, Belshazzar, king of Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. That night, what God said was going to happen actually happened. Because he's a God who sets up whoever he chooses over the kingdoms of men. He's the universal God. Daniel chapter 2, he told Nebuchadnezzar he was the head of gold, and after him would come a silver kingdom that wouldn't be as good as the kingdom before. This is the beginnings of the fulfillment of what God had said. Through a king who refused to listen to God himself. So God sent his man to say to him, you need to hear what God has to say. And to give to Belshazzar that opportunity, just simply to repent and say, I've got this completely wrong. As far as we know, he never said anything like it, because God's plans will never ever be thwarted. They will always go to their fruition. One of the wonderful things about chapter 2 is that the moment the head of gold falls, then comes the chest of silver. You know that you're on your way to the final kingdom, that smashes down all kingdoms of this world as a rock that becomes a mountain in the whole of the earth, which is the kingdom of God and of his Son. And Daniel knew from that moment onwards, although he would probably never see any further change of kingdom, that God's calendar was running. And soon it would be that Jesus would reign, where'er the sun does his successive journeys run, his kingdom stretch from shore to shore, till moons shall wax and wane no more. It was but the start. But we have a God who is the God of heaven, who sets up those in his kingdom. Whoever he chooses, that he's the God absolutely, totally, completely, 100% in control of the affairs of this life, whatever it might look like. And we go into Thursday's election or not. However you might decide, knowing that it's not about Europe, and it's not about our government, whoever that might be, but it's about a God who's up in heaven, whose power is endless, and whose kingdom is eternal. Let's pray, shall we? Thank you, Lord. Thank you for encouraging us with your word. Thank you for the stories of the Old Testament that come to life as we walk through them with you. We praise you, Lord, that you are still on the throne. We thank you that your plans will never, ever be thwarted. Nobody can stop them. And we thank you, Lord, for allowing us to be a very small part of those amazing and wonderful plans. And we ask of you, Lord, will you just give us the grace that you gave to Daniel?